Today we will be designing a sticker. Uh, it's gonna be a lady wearing a military style hat with like thick locks. So when you're designing a hat like that, you want to block out the bigger shapes and then add in the later details like I did just there. Um, it's okay if you are not feeling satisfied with the shape. It's one of the reasons I love digital art. You can just like mold and readjust things. You can see me adding the detail. I'm not too careful about my lines because this is a sketch, so I want to be as loose as possible. Doing that lets you make decisions faster and edit them on the fly. Yeah. So you're going to want to block out the shadows on the face, especially the parts that are going to be the darkest. You're going to want to block them out with your line work. That helps a lot when you're shading. It helps to know where, okay, this is where the line stops. I was thinking about adding some scars, but I was like, no, let me just leave the side with the lights, like, let me leave it like unblemished. And sketching the dreads, you want to make them thick. I don't want to make them too thin. That's a style I'm going for in this one. And readjusting the lips. Yeah, just like making sure the sketch feels right, adding all the necessary things before I go into the inking phase. You want to make sure all the individual locks lead to, they have a place where they stop. You don't want to just have the hair tangled and not have an end or hiding the end. So it's very important to keep in mind where the lock starts and where it ends, especially if they're going to be intertwined, because that adds to the realism. And you also want to add the shadows around the areas that would be, hidden from the lights, or like, something casting a shadow, like the locks over each other would cast shadows, different shadows over themselves. So I'm kind of erasing all the minor details here, making sure it's like a little bit smoother before I get into the inking. So when I'm inking, I like to start with the place with the most dark. So I'm gonna start with the face and get that nice lip shape in. This is the part where you have to be careful and you make sure your lines are, you don't want any unnecessary lines, you don't want any unnecessary shading. I like to shade on my ink layer, and I use a variation of brushes, but mostly I use only two brushes on Krita here. So like I said, you like to highlight the areas where the shadows start and stop. It gives you kind of this already fitting guideline for when you want to add the shadows and detailing. Working with different brush sizes is also really important. Like, you can use the same brush, but you need to keep different variations in the size of the brush, whether it's, oh, I'm using this for the outline, I'm using this for the shadow, I'm using this for some minor details on the inside. You just want to keep adjusting the size of your brush. What this does is it creates different like weight values for the drawing, and it makes it look more three-dimensional when like, oh, different objects have different like weights to them. Like, you see how I'm doing the lines on the hat? They're a bit thicker than the ones I used on the face because it's a much broader subject. And yeah, see me again reducing the lines using the same brush tool to erase. You never want to be shy of making mistakes when you're doing the line work, because you can always use that same brush to erase if you're using Krita. And I like to just create that smooth outline and erase all the excess. but I don't like it too perfect, so sometimes I do leave a few blemishes here. Here I attempt to, draw it again, but I don't think there's a point doing that when I can just duplicate that side and later edit it. So right now I was kind of deciding, where do I go from here? Do I keep working on the hat, or do I move on to the hair? So I decided, like, yeah, let me just finish up the hat first. And sometimes you want to get a particular block of detail done. I invert and warp it around just so it fits the angle and perspective. So you see here again how I use the different line width in order to achieve different effects. Like, I've been using the same one brush for the entire hat, and I change it a couple times. I change the line width a couple times based on what I want to do, because there's two different main textures on the hat. We have metal and then we have the cloth. So I shade the metal differently than I shade the cloth. I use this method where I block out the entire thing in black. I leave out some edges, and I like to reduce the size of the brush so later go over those edges. Your whites are also important when you're dealing with cloth. And then I use a separate brush when it's time to shade the metal, because you want the shadows a bit more like rough and not as uniform when working with metal, because light is going to be hitting it, it's going to be reflecting. There's a lot to account for. And yeah, I'm going over to the face. I'm going to use that same shading technique for the lip, because she's going to have like this metallic-ish lip makeup on. And yeah, going back to the hats, sometimes I like to finish one section, sometimes I like to keep adding, go back to it, so I keep like having time to think about what I'm going to do when I'm moving back to it. So for creating scratch lines, you're gonna want to use that same brush as an eraser. You're gonna reduce it a lot till you get to a point where, like, oh, it's really thin, and you're gonna erase lines, and then you're gonna go back over those lines with some like thin like line work. And now I'm doing the locks. For the locks, when you're drawing hair, you never want it to be too smooth, so I kind of create this little wiggly lines when I'm drawing the locks, and I don't like press on my brush too hard. You want to be a bit loose when you're doing hair, because it's solid, but hair has a lot of like mobility to it, so you want it to look like, oh, this has weight and form, but it's also like really soft. And that's the look I went for with the hair. And in shading, I'm going to use a textured brush, because like I said, you want it to be textured, you don't want it too smooth, because its hair has a rough texture, and especially if you're drawing locks, which is my main focus in drawing hair. Yeah, gonna make some edits, make sure all the line work is the way it's supposed to be before I decide to shade the face. So you want like 2 or 3 different layers of shadows. There's gonna be the shadow inside the shadow. There's gonna be the area that has a little less shadow, and you can like erase some parts of it out just to give this effect of like a reflecting light. And then I'm gonna shading the parts of the hair I've already blocked out. See why it's important to block out the parts that have shadows. Makes it easier to connect, because at the edge of every shadow, the shadow is always going to be a bit darker, and so already shading out the shadows where they're going to be gives me this, oh yes, I already know where the shading is going to be placed. And for me, line work is my most complicated method, because when you're making line work, you have to put all these things into consideration. But when you're coloring, it's just, oh, this color goes here, and so it's not as difficult or tasking when coloring. But yeah, I do enjoy the process of line work and shading. Added an extra lock there just to give that extra thickness, so you can see how the locks are kind of tangled. And going to go back to the hat and use like a lighter blue to create this like reflection, because it's cloth. You want to have like varying levels of shadows. You never just want to have one blocked out shadow. I think this is something I also recently learned, and gonna be practicing it a lot more often. Okay, now we're blocking out the colors. We start out with the hat, uh, you know, then we go in with the skin color and the hair on top, because the hair is going to be on top of the skin, so anything you do to the skin is going to end up under the hair. This is where I add my textures. I use this vinyl texture, and I always reduce it to half opacity because the texture is a bit strong. And then you're going to want to add a color overlay. Now this is going to change over the process of the whole drawing as I decide what are the final colors going to be. So initially I went with like a dirty blonde on the hair, but I was kind of feeling for something else later, so I ended up making it blue, and I think that worked for me better. So yeah, I'm gonna take some time out to separate the individual pieces on the hat and color them. So you're gonna also want to like be aware of your layers and how you're like, oh, this is on top of what is on top of what. So you're not mistaking when you're coloring. You want to know where everything is, but at the same time you don't want to create too many layers. So I have all the metallic aspects of the hat on one layer, and then the cloth is on another. So now I'm gonna be working on the lips, teeth. You never want to use like a straight white for the teeth, because no matter what, the teeth is not actually like white, especially not if it's like underneath a shadow. And here you see me playing with the color overlay, and then I finally decide, okay, I think I want like a dark blue for the hair, and make sure you add gradients to give this like variation and depth when you're coloring the hair. And the texture gives the hair more life, because it feels like, oh, this is a three-dimensional surfaces. That's what like shadows and textures do. So it's a combination of both. And I'm gonna add some highlights to the edges of the shadow to show like, oh, this is what, because when light hits you, you get a reflection of what's underneath, so which would be blood. So you're gonna put some red there. I keep trying the yellow, but I eventually just like, yeah, I'm gonna stick with the blue. And yeah, color the shadows. You want to use like a deeper purple color when you're using blue. You never want to color with the same like tone. So I'm gonna go here with some highlights in the center line of the lighter parts of the hair, and I start bright with them, but you can see I'm going to eventually like reduce the opacity, and then I add some shadows to the edge of the hair to show like its thickness. You always want to keep in mind that you're trying to make the drawing look three-dimensional, which is what's really important for me, is making it look like it's gonna come out of the screen, like it's gonna come out of the drawing. And that's like how I design my stickers. I like them to really pop out. Messing with the edits here. Yeah, this is the color theory. This is the color. This is the parts I ended up going with. You can see me readjusting all the settings to make sure everything is the way it's supposed to be. I go over the shadow here with a multiply layer. At the same time, I don't want it to be too dark, but I want the shadow to be like realistically respected, if that makes any sense. But yeah, that's most of it done, and then we get to the background, which I made look like an A as per because of the shape of her hair. So yeah, this was really fun to work on, and happy to share this process with you guys and really get to explain my thought process going into it and how I did achieve all this. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm looking forward to, making more in the future.